Hi Concordia, thanks for joining us for chapel today. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. Quarantine, COVID-19, coronavirus, vulnerable groups, social distancing, risk factors. I read an article that these terms are already permanently implanted in our social psyche for the rest of our lives because of the current crisis that we're in. That's pretty wild to think about. And if there's one thing we've learned so far in the middle of this crisis, it's that quarantine and isolation are critical for stopping the spread of this disease. We have to quarantine and keep clean things clean while we also quarantine those who are sick so that we can heal and cleanse them before putting them back into society so they can be with their loved ones. It means that if anybody's exposed, we need to be extra cautious about making sure this thing doesn't spread any farther. Temporary isolation is necessary for a better and healthier future for all of us. In Genesis, we're told about a similar historical outbreak, but arguably the Genesis outbreak is the world's worst pandemic, the most devastating epidemic of all time. In Genesis 3, we learn that every inch of our planet was affected, that every living thing was terminally infected, and that everything else, the non-living stuff, was adversely affected permanently. I can't overstate how absolutely and completely devastating sin was and is, because every good thing in our world has been touched and broken and affected by that original sin virus. It took hold of Adam and Eve, and the result of that sin outbreak is that everyone is sick. No one is clean. Everyone is sin sick because this disease is both genetic and viral. It's got a long incubation period. It lingers and it lurks in every corner, damaging everything it touches. The sin virus, you could call it Gen 3 or the fall virus. I don't care what you call it. But it spread because of the introduction of doubt and disobedience to God's good plan. It took a hold of Adam and Eve in their hearts and immediately exposed everything in creation to self-destruction. And so in Genesis 3, we learned that a quarantine was placed upon us. And now I really want to make this clear. It's not like we inherited all of this from Adam and Eve because they blew it and we got stuck with it, no fault of our own. No. We also allow this virus to enter our hearts, our minds, our bodies, our souls. This is something that we have allowed every time that we break the two great commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You see, every sin falls into one of those two categories and sometimes both. We are either putting something else above God, or we are harming our relationships with the people around us, harming relationships with ourselves and with creation. And it's sin that does that. If you've ever wondered why there are mosquitoes or viruses or poisonous plants, or what in the world would God have done? Why would he create droughts and any of these weird, bad, terrible things? Well, I want to clarify something for you. Those things exist because we, in the midst of our disobedience, introduced sin sickness to the entire good creation. It was our brokenness that messed up God's good design. We see glimmers, amazing, beautiful glimmers every day of all the good design that God put into his creation. You think about order and symmetry and beauty and color and music and relationships and the gift of life itself. All of those are awesome. But every single one of them can also be corrupted and broken and painful and awful. Every single one of them has been affected. From what? From this sin virus. And we're stuck in quarantine. As we know from current experience, quarantine and isolation are critical to stopping the spread, and they are a temporary means to a much better end. I'm thankful for all of those who are following the precautions to stop this COVID virus from spreading. And in the middle of all this isolation, social distancing that we're practicing, I'm drawn to some heart-wrenching stories about people who are separated from one another at critical times. I think about Concordia families who haven't been able to see loved ones in the hospital because the hospital is setting up restrictions. I think about people who have been exposed and who have to be cautious about it. I think about people who have special risk factors that make them more susceptible to bad outcomes or worse symptoms. And then I also hear stories, not necessarily about Concordia families, but just of all the people out there. I heard a story recently about all these women who were told that they're expecting, they're pregnant, they're about to give birth anytime, but they've just been told that their husbands can't be in the delivery room with them. How devastating for those dads to not be able to be there with their wives to hold their hand through the difficult labor process, and how terrible for the wives not to have that support system, and then how awful for those dads not to be able to greet their babies face to face like they had hoped and planned. It breaks my heart how much we have to be separated. We see these stories and we hear about people who know that quarantine is needed, and so they still long to be with their loved ones, so they come up with creative ideas to get close. I know many of you have grandparents who are in nursing homes, and you're probably like me, unable to go and visit them because of all the restrictions. Well, my 96-year-old grandmother does not get to have visitors, so my parents who live nearby, they decided to make a poster and hold it outside the window of her nursing home room so that she would know that we're thinking about her. And I've seen this, all over the internet. That's where we got the inspiration. And it makes me feel good that there are people trying to make this difficult time better. And yet nothing will compare to that post-quarantine hug, that real, true, full interaction with our loved ones that right now we don't have. I want to point you to the story of a father who not too long ago was desperate to see his daughter who was sick. She was in quarantine for a serious illness, a terminal illness, one that was going to take her life. It targeted her heart. It was destroying her body. And if nothing were going to be done, she would die. So this father sent messages to his daughter through doctors and nurses because he couldn't go visit her in person. He stood outside the quarantine windows and he showed her signs and he wrote her messages. And finally, he loved her so much and wanted her to be reminded of it constantly. He set up a tent outside the window of her hospital room so that he would not be apart from her any longer during her vulnerable time. He would press his ear up against the window and listen to everything that she had to say. He would smile at her. He would laugh with her. He would cry with her. And he was always trying to remind her to fight back against the disease that was ravishing her body, to fight back and to remember that he was there. Do you know this story? Have you heard this story? Do you have any idea that that Father is your own? That is the God of the universe? That is how desperately he longs to be with you who are sin sick and in quarantine on this planet. So much so that I'm not making the thing up about the tent. If you look at Exodus chapter 25 to 31, there's a whole description of the tent that God literally had set up in the wilderness so that he would not be separated from his sick kids in their most vulnerable time. That's the kind of love that this Father has for his children, that he has for you. Did you know that Scripture says that God presses his ear close to the earth so that he can hear everything that you have on your heart? He wants it all to be cast on him. Did you know that that's the kind of love that God has for you? That even though we're quarantined from him because of our sickness, he will not be separated from you. There isn't a day, a night, a sickness, a plague. There's nothing on this planet that can keep him from being at your side, whether you recognize it or not. And I don't know, maybe God has been camped outside your window, but it's been pretty dark, and so you haven't seen him. Or maybe just maybe, you shut the curtains and you stopped looking for your daddy outside the window. I don't know, but God has sent you messages in Scripture. Have you read them? God has put signs in the heavens. He has put beauty and order and symmetry and music in every part of creation to show you how much he loves you and to show you what you were designed to be part of and what you have to look forward to because of his love. Did you know that? More important than any of that, I need you to know how this story ends. How does your story end? Your dad doesn't stay outside that window. No. One day at just the right time, he smashes through that hospital wing window. He climbs in and he offers up his clean and healthy body for your sick one. He takes on every disgusting virus-filled part of you, and he gives you everything of himself. And when he takes all of that sin sickness in himself, he defeats it so that you can be clean with his righteousness and so that he can defeat that virus forever. And you don't maybe believe me about him smashing through the window, but if you've ever heard the story about the temple curtain, right? That tabernacle curtain that's been there from the beginning when God was in that quarantine in the wilderness with his people and he set up that tent in the tabernacle. There's always been this curtain there. It's like the window, the glass, where God is pressing his ear close and we're on the other side. We're desperate and we're as close as we can be because of our sin sickness. That got smashed. The day that Jesus died, we have record that the temple curtain tore in two from top to bottom because God would no longer be separated from you, his children. What amazing news is that? And that's exactly what our passage from the book of Hebrews talks about. I want to read it for you. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his body. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. You see, isolation is the work of the devil. That's his goal. He wants to isolate and separate you from God and from other people. And sin is the way that he does that for both goals. Sin is how he separates you from God, and sin is how he separates you from your brothers and sisters, from your family, from all people on this planet. So how do we fight back against that isolation? You see, the truth of the matter is that we just heard in Hebrews is that you are clean. On the day that Jesus died, on the day that he rose from the dead, on the day of your baptism, on the day that you joined God's family, you were given a clean, new, virus-free, sin-free being. You were made clean enough to enter into God's very presence. And there's nothing that can separate you from that relationship to God anymore unless you let it. Because sin was defeated on that day. Jesus took on the sin of the entire world, and he paid the price for your sin, for my sin, for every person who has ever lived and will ever live. Jesus paid the price for all of it. He took the sin sickness in himself and destroyed it. And so now the only reason that we aren't entering the presence of God is maybe because we've shut the curtain. Maybe because we've closed our eyes. Maybe because we've ignored the messages and the signs that God is holding up, and he's banging on the windows and he's got his ears close and he's saying, please come to me. Or maybe he's standing in the hospital room and he's looking you in the face. Maybe he's sending you messages from doctors and nurses like, hey, come on. You're healed. You're better. You're good. So let's live differently. And maybe we're ignoring him. I mean, I think about all the ways that sometimes we approach God in the same way that we kind of approach this COVID-19 situation. Like, I don't know if I want to go over and see so-and-so because I don't know if I'm clean enough. I don't know if I'm healthy enough. Or maybe it's just so much work to go out of my comfort zone. Maybe I'm actually really enjoying this whole quarantine thing. That's the kind of stuff that separates us from God. But he has broken through that quarantine. It has nothing to do with God's vulnerability to our sin sickness. It has everything to do with our own feelings of inadequacy, our identity, our apathy. So let's not let that stand in our way anymore. Hebrews says we should stir each other up to do good works, knowing that our Father is right here, He is faithful, and that we are clean. We should live new lives, not lives ruled by sin, because the reality is that one day we're going to walk out of this quarantine. Not this COVID-19 quarantine. No. We're going to leave the hospital room called Earth, and we're going to walk out of quarantine, and for the first time after our sickness, we are going to get the biggest embrace from our Daddy God, who loves us and who has been waiting for this day, who died and rose again so that we could have this day. That is such good news that why would I stay living in a quarantine kind of life? And here in Hebrews it says, let's spur each other on to love and good works. Absolutely. Why are we living as though we're sick and dying anymore? We shouldn't. So how do we fight back against this sin sickness while we're still in this hospital room called Earth kind of quarantine? I've got some advice for you. First, remember your baptism. Remember that Jesus rose from the dead and you have been washed clean. As Hebrews says, your consciences and your hearts have been sprinkled clean by Jesus' blood. And here's a great way that you can remember it. Every time that you're washing your hands for that 20-second time for the COVID virus and all that, while you're singing happy birthday twice, you can remember that you have been born again. You are new. And let that cause you to draw near to God. The second one, flee temptation. Run away. If there is anything that is calling you back into that sickness, I urge you to actively turn around and walk the other direction. Whether that means you close that laptop lid, you put your phone down, you take a deep breath before you say that thing in anger to your family, whatever it is, you change your habits, you change your mindset. Flee that temptation. The third thing that I want to remind you to is to enter the light. Because sin loves to hide in darkness, but by entering the light, this is what I mean. I mean, calling out what your sin is, talking about it to God, talking about it to your loved ones, talking about it to an accountability partner. Because once that weight is lifted, once you put it on Jesus, you can be freed from that burden, knowing that He defeated it. And entering that light and walking with somebody who loves you and cares for you is a beautiful way to step out in faith for what God has done for you. And last of all, walk together. I'm not asking you to break quarantine. Please don't go out and, be in close contact with people right now. That's not what I'm saying. But we are called to walk together because isolation is from the devil. Separation is from the devil. Unity comes from God. Unity comes from His good design for us to be united to Him and to one another in love. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. When those two things are done, we are unified. So how can we be unified in the middle of social distancing? We can be unified by actively praying for each other, reaching out digitally, worshiping together online. We can be those encouraging people to one another. We can be the light. We can be the advocate. We can help one another flee from sin. And we can spur each other on, stir each other up to do those good and loving works for the people around us. So remember your baptism, flee temptation, enter the light, and walk together. And remember, your daddy loves you. He's never been far away. Open up the curtain, press your ear close to his, and listen to him tell you how much he loves you and how you are made new. God bless.